This is Nepal. This is Bangladesh. This is Sri Lanka. July 13th, 2022. Sri Lanka's president Gotabaya Rajapaksa flees his country. He resigns the following day whilst in exile. August 5th, 2024. Bangladesh's Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina resigns and flees the country. September 9th, 2025. Nepal's Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli resigns and goes into hiding. In all three cases, the resignations weren't voluntary. They were the result of mass protests. Protests that rocked the South Asian nations to their very foundations. Three countries, all in South Asia, all of them see violent revolutions that lead to regime change. To decipher this, to make sense of the situation, let's go to the beginning, to the first South Asian nation hit by revolution, Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, the protests were sparked by gross economic mismanagement. We'll go through the timeline real quick. 2005, Mahinda Rajapaksa gets elected president of Sri Lanka. 2007, Sri Lanka offers its first international sovereign bond, starting on the journey to take on unsustainable debt. 2015, Mahinda Rajapaksa is voted out. His successor tries to bring the economy back on track. Unpopular IMF-backed reforms such as tax hikes are implemented. 2019, Mahinda's brother, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, wins the presidential election. Mahinda is appointed prime minister. All the previous administration's reforms are undone. 2020, COVID-19 pandemic sweeps Sri Lanka. Borders shut. Tourism industry decimated. Major source of foreign exchange dries up. 2021, Gotabaya Rajapaksa mandates organic farming. Chemical fertilizers banned. Sri Lankan tea industry decimated. Another source of foreign exchange gone. Meanwhile, foreign debt rises to 101% of Sri Lanka's GDP. Colombo declares an economic emergency. Which brings us to 2022. There was a food shortage, electricity shortage, fuel shortage. Inflation hit 17.5% by February 2022 and rose to 21.5% the next month. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka had a mountain of debt and not enough foreign exchange reserves to pay it off. So, it officially defaulted on its foreign debt in April 2022. Protests had already started by then. Sri Lankans all over the country began demonstrating peacefully. They called it the Aragalaya, meaning the struggle. The protesters created encampments in Colombo. They demanded the resignation of the Rajapaksas. The Rajapaksas hit back with violence, both by the state security forces and by Rajapaksa loyalists. Things came to a head on May 9, 2022, when Rajapaksa supporters were sent on a rampage against the protesters. It was called Black Monday. That was the breaking point. After that, the protesters retaliated. They burnt down several properties linked to the Rajapaksas or politicians in their party. It was absolute chaos. Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned as prime minister on that day. The Sri Lankan military was deployed after Black Monday. Mahinda Rajapaksa was also replaced by Ranil Wickremesinghe as prime minister. This brought a brief lull in the chaos and the violence. However, on July 9th, exactly 2 months after Black Monday, protesters stormed the presidential palace and set the prime minister's residence on fire. You may remember these scenes. Gotabaya Rajapaksa went into hiding after the presidential palace was breached. Then, on July 13th, he fled Sri Lanka and went to the Maldives. He officially resigned on July 14th. This is the broad outline of events in Sri Lanka. Gross economic mismanagement by one political dynasty set off the Sri Lankan protests. The demonstrations were initially peaceful. The state used heavy-handed tactics to suppress dissent. The protests turned violent in the face of repression. Angry demonstrators stormed public buildings and set others on fire. The offending politicians were forced to resign. That's broadly the step-by-step of Sri Lanka's revolution. Now, let's look at example number 2, Bangladesh. The revolution in Bangladesh was also sparked by economic anxieties. It began with a protest against job reservations and morphed into something much bigger. But the background is important, so we'll put up the timeline. 2008, Sheikh Hasina's party, the Awami League, wins the general election in a landslide. 2009, Sheikh Hasina begins her second term as Prime Minister of Bangladesh. 2010, Bangladesh's government job reservation or quota system is changed. Reservation extended to the grandchildren of freedom fighters. 2011, Bangladesh's existing system of holding elections under an independent interim caretaker government is deemed illegal. Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League get de facto power to oversee elections. 2014, opposition parties boycott the election. The Awami League wins the general election with another landslide because of the boycott. 2018, mass student protests against Bangladesh's quota system. Sheikh Hasina is forced to scrap the entire quota system. Sheikh Hasina wins the 2018 general election in another landslide. But allegations of widespread rigging. Which brings us to 2024. Another election boycotted by opposition parties, another landslide for Sheikh Hasina. But the chaos began in June when Bangladesh's High Court ordered the return of job quotas. Before they were scrapped in 2018, quotas made up a majority of Bangladesh's civil service jobs. A 10% quota for women, 10% for people from Bangladesh's underdeveloped districts, 5% for ethnic minorities, 1% for people with disabilities, and a whopping 30% for freedom fighters and their descendants. Together, the quotas took up 56% of all government jobs, leaving just 44% open to the public. That's why there was so much opposition to the quota system from Bangladeshi students. They felt that even after years of studying, government jobs were out of reach. And the 30% quota for freedom fighters was especially unpopular. Sheikh Hasina's party, the Awami League, had led Bangladesh's independence struggle in 1971. So naturally, most people benefiting from the freedom fighter quota were Awami League members and their descendants. Thus, the freedom fighter quota was seen as a way for Sheikh Hasina to reward her loyalists. Bangladesh's High Court ordered the reinstatement of the quota system on June 5, 2024. Students began protesting at their colleges immediately. The protests were peaceful. The student protests intensified in July, with hundreds taking to the streets every day to block major roads all over the country. On July 14th, Sheikh Hasina made a major mistake. She compared the protesting students to Razakars, traitors who had collaborated with Pakistani forces during Bangladesh's independence struggle. This infuriated the student protesters. The Awami League latched onto the Razakar slur, using it as a pretext to attack the protesters. Members of the party's youth wing, the Chhatro League, began attacking student protesters. Sheikh Hasina ordered a crackdown. Bangladeshi security forces joined the attacks on student protesters. Over 1,500 people were killed. Tens of thousands were injured. It was a breaking point. The protests stopped being about quota reform. After the mass killings, there was just one demand: Sheikh Hasina's ouster. She resigned and fled Bangladesh on August 5th. Just after she departed, protesters stormed the Prime Minister's official residence. Let's compare Bangladesh to Sri Lanka. Here's the chain of events in Sri Lanka again for reference. In Bangladesh, economic anxiety among the youth because of the job quotas led to student protests. The demonstrations were initially peaceful. The state used heavy-handed tactics to suppress dissent. The protests turned violent in the face of repression. Angry demonstrators stormed public buildings. The offending politicians were forced to resign. Barring the trigger, it's exactly the same. Let's see if this pattern holds for our next case study, Nepal. Time for the timeline again. Or so I'd like to say. But you can't really do that with Nepal. The political instability in the Himalayan nation is absurd. The Prime Minister who just got ousted, KP Sharma Oli, it was his fourth premiership in the last 10 years. Before Oli's latest term, Pushpa Kamal Dahal, also known as Prachand, he was Prime Minister. It was his third stint. Before Prachand, it was Sher Bahadur Deoba. Deoba was on his fifth prime ministerial term. After having replaced Oli, it has been a ridiculous merry-go-round. The same people forming governments over and over again. No one lasting an entire term. The last time one of Nepal's prime ministers completed even 4 years in power was all the way back in 1983. Since then, prime ministers on average last for 1 to 2 years at most, until they come back because of the merry-go-round. Now, as you can imagine, this sort of insane instability does not make for a great economic situation. Let's zoom out and look at South Asia, all of South Asia. It's these 7 countries, with Afghanistan getting included from time to time. But Afghanistan has different problems, so we'll put it aside right now. Of all the 7 standard South Asian nations, Nepal is the poorest. It has the lowest per capita income, less than 60% of Bangladesh's, less than a third of Sri Lanka's. A third of Nepal's GDP comes in the form of remittances from Nepali citizens who moved abroad for jobs. Inside the country, youth unemployment is over 20%, meaning jobs are scarce. So, obviously, public anger in Nepal was high. All it needed was a spark, and that came in the form of a social media ban. On September 4th, Nepal's government banned 26 social media platforms. WhatsApp, YouTube, Facebook, Snapchat, LinkedIn, Twitter or X, everything was banned, ostensibly for failing to register with the government under some new rules. This caused Nepal's youth to snap. There's the economic impact, of course. A lot of people depend on social media for their livelihoods. In Nepal, where job opportunities are already low, and a lot of people are struggling to make ends meet, banning social media is making a bad situation worse. And the timing of the ban also coincided with a social media trend taking hold of Nepal. #NepoKids had been trending in the country. People had been sharing photos and videos which showed the stark disparity between ordinary people and the children of politicians. While ordinary Nepali citizens struggled to make ends meet, political scions wore designer clothes and went on luxury vacations. This contrast was trending in Nepali social media. So, the timing of the social media ban was questioned. Young people in Nepal, members of Gen Z, organized a mass protest on Monday. Tens of thousands took to the streets and demonstrated peacefully. But later in the day, the situation changed. People began marching towards the area of Kathmandu which housed parliament. Some people tried to scale the gates of the parliament complex. Security forces responded with force. At least 19 people were killed. Protest organizers say that opportunists had infiltrated the movement to incite chaos. Investigations are still underway over who and what started the clashes. But the heavy-handed response by the police, which included the use of live ammunition, led to the death of protesters. The police shot at children who were in their school uniforms, which was unacceptable. The following day, hundreds of thousands took to the streets. They stormed Parliament and burnt it down. Politicians' houses were set ablaze. It was carnage. Prime Minister Oli resigned and went into hiding. As with Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, the chain of events stays mostly intact. Young Nepali people began protesting. The trigger is a social media ban and public anger over the economy and Nepo kids. The demonstrations were initially peaceful. The state used heavy-handed tactics to suppress dissent. The protesters turned violent in the face of repression. Angry demonstrators stormed public buildings. The offending politicians were forced to resign. The trigger is different, but the rest is the same. 3 revolutions in little more than 3 years, all in South Asia. Is this like the 2011 Arab Spring? Is it the Asian or South Asian Spring? As you saw, the revolutions all had most things in common. Young people in all 3 countries were anxious about the economy. They felt that their existing political systems were rife with corruption. Eventually, these economic issues led to protests. The triggers were different, but economic anxieties were at the heart of all 3 movements. The state's default response, the use of force, brought public anger to a boiling point. And the end result was regime change. The underlying issues aren't restricted to South Asia. Economic problems and corruption are by no means unique to the region. And young people all over the world are angry. Just a few days before Nepal, Indonesia found itself in the middle of its own Gen Z protest. Again, it was about perceived corruption by political elites. Their president, Prabowo Subianto, barely managed to defuse the situation. The trend of Gen Z protests may have actually begun in Kenya in 2024, with protests against their president, William Ruto, and his taxation policies. The Kenyan protests didn't lead to Ruto's ouster though, despite chants of Ruto must go ringing across the country. South Asia itself almost saw a 4th revolution back in 2023. Pakistan rose up to protest what they saw as a rigged election. But that demonstration was in support of a politician, Imran Khan. Khan was locked up, leaving the protesters without their leader. Pakistan's establishment went on to try people in military courts. Pakistan's government survived. So there's nothing to suggest that Gen Z protests are bound to succeed, or that South Asia is especially vulnerable. The only thing for certain is that bad economic policies will eventually come to bite governments in the backside. Young people today are better connected than ever before. They can see what's happening all over the world, and they refuse to suffer in silence. The best thing for governments to do is get their acts together and work for the people instead of for themselves. That's the only sure shot way to keep the people happy and the protesters at bay.